Good morning. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the legislative branch, even though last time I promised you today we would start through the executive branch. I don't know where my head was when I made that promise, but it obviously wasn't in the right place. So let's talk today, or let's finish up today our discussion of the legislative branch. Let's do a quick review of some of the points that we've covered thus far. An overarching theme from the beginning has been that we have seen a movement in the last 50 years or so, actually 70 years or so, away from something called congressional government to presidential government. And I believed in my snide way, I even referred to it as imperial government. And I cautioned about that, but I think it's something to consider. We spent some time talking about the concept of representation. We've made the point that on the whole, our Congress does not represent the American people descriptively. If you look at the Congress, you do not see a cross-section of the American population by any means. On the contrary, you see what amounts to a financial, educational, ethnic, racial elite who see themselves as a professional class, who see themselves as professionals performing a professional job. The concept of duty as a motivator, in many respects, has given way to the concept of personal advancement or professionalization as a motivator to get involved in legislation. We spent a lot of time talking about the concept of constituency. I'm not going to go over all of that now, other than to remind you that we must divest ourselves of the notion of constituency as consisting of Atticus Finch up here at the Capitol and everybody else back in the hometown in a personal relationship with our congressman, with our representative, or with our senator. And remember that constituency involves organized interests, seated in the district to be sure, but also that have relations with components outside the district. We spent a lot of time talking about gerrymandering. I'm not going to go over that again, other than to simply remind you of the fact that it's not going to go away anytime soon. We have a census coming up in, well, I guess it isn't coming up all that. Yeah, in 3 years we have a census coming up. So 4 years from now, we're going to go through a fight all over again. And it's particularly important because what's been happening at the local level in terms of changes is very, very dramatic. Then, we spent some time talking about, and here's where I really do want to start spending a bit more time. We said that in the DNA of our legislative branch, I think I even used the term in the genie, in the being of our legislative branch, there are 4 concepts that give it form and give it energy and determine its rhythms. And we said one was universalism. When it comes to passing legislation, you want to spread the goods around. You want to spread the benefits around. If politics represents the struggle or the conflict, the process of distributing public goods, obviously it's to everyone's advantage to get some of those public goods. So it is to the advantage of the legislator to see that things are spread around as widely as possible. We talked about log rolling. If you're going to be an effective congressman, you have to have a good relationship with your colleagues. And part of that means you scratch his back or her back, she'll scratch yours. And you cooperate to get things done in that way. We talked about earmarks. We made the point that earmarks are less public now than they used to be, but they haven't gone away. An earmark is simply a proposal that goes into a bill on any subject at all and says that a certain amount of money shall be spent on a particular project. That is usually in some which is always in some legislator's district. And I think I used the example of extending the width of a bridge across the Neuse River, or even our new bridge into Beaufort. That's a question of earmarks, log rolling, and not to say that it's not necessary or that it won't be good, but that's an example of what I'm trying to talk about. And then the third thing we said, or yes, it's the fourth thing, dealt with the notion of, excuse me, seniority as a concept that informs the way our legislature works. I think I used the example of my airplane pilot's son, who explained to me once, "Dad, the only thing you need to get ahead in the airline industry is to be alive and at the controls for a long period of time, and then you simply get promoted and up the ladder you go." So, seniority. Now, I don't think I did say, and this is where we get into some new things, I talked about party as the key to holding the organization of Congress together. Traditionally, that has been the case. When the lines are drawn and you have to come down to a specific decision, the decision is usually made on the basis of your party affiliation. Democrats vote the Democratic line, Republicans vote the Republican line. And you could always count on that, and that is the way it was done. If you did not follow the party line, then it became possible to be subject to certain measures of discipline, which we'll talk about in just a second, that could work to your disadvantage. The imperative was to vote the party line. Your position within the legislative branch was a function of your standing in your party. The higher you stood in the party, the higher you stood in the organization of the legislative branch, and vice versa. The higher you were in the organization of the legislative branch, the higher you were in the organization of your party. It was mutually reinforcing. My point is that today we are finding, and I'll speak more about this in just a moment. I really do keep track of these in just a moment things, and I promise I will get back to it. We will see how that is beginning to change. Now, on page 294 of your text, there is a chart that just lists the number of committees in the House and in the Senate. Congress does its work through committees. If I counted correctly, there are 20 plus in the House and 21 plus in the Senate. You can correct my count. The committees are organized on a sectoral basis or on a functional basis. You have committees for foreign relations, you have committees for agriculture, you have committees for health and human services. Each sort of functional area of government has one or two committees that deal with it. Every committee has what is called a jurisdiction, an area for which it is responsible. And it represents the House's or the Senate's highest organization, highest ranking, highest level organization to deal with a particular issue. Okay? We speak of, I guess, 4 different kinds of committees. There are what are called standing committees. These are the ones that I have just mentioned. Every Congress, no matter who's in charge or who is in the majority, will keep in some form or another these basic 21 committees that are divided by area. We call these standing committees. Then we have select committees. If there is a problem that the House or the Senate leadership feels needs to be investigated very, very carefully, they may select, a certain number of their members to investigate that committee. We had the Senate Select Committee on Watergate. Find out what went on with Watergate. There may soon be a select committee on Russian interference in one aspect or another of our elections. We don't. We have some beginnings of that, but there may be a formal select committee on that. The select committee goes away after it writes its report, or after its report is written. Then we have something called a joint committee. There are a number, not too many, 3, 4, 5 committees that both the House and the Senate share. For example, I spent a lot of my time in Washington working on behalf of the Joint Committee on Economic Relations, which had a project to go on China. And so for a period of 3 years, didn't work for, but I was called upon by members of that committee to write various reports and testify various times about what was going on in China. And then we have something called conference committees. If the House passes a bill and the Senate passes a bill, it's only by a miracle that those two bills will be exactly the same in every way. It's not even rare. It's rarer than rare. If you can think of a word that means rarer than rare, let me know, okay? Because I'd like to be able to use it. Therefore, we have to have something called a conference committee, where members of the Senate and members of the House sit down and look at their respective bills, iron out the whole process, and get the language worked out so that both sides can agree to it. Goes back to the main committee, and then so on and so forth. Now, committee membership is a function of the proportion of Democrats and Republicans in the House or Senate. If you have a Senate, right now, the chairs and the larger number of members of all committees in the House and Senate are held by Republicans, because Republicans have a majority in the House and have a majority in the Senate. So, yes, committees are partisan. 2 committees are unique to the House, and those are the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and the so-called Rules Committee. More about that in a moment. That's the 4th thing I have to come back to this morning. The Rules Committee. Membership on a committee is perhaps the most important thing that a legislator, congressman or senator, representative or senator, has to be concerned about. Obviously, as I think I said last term, you don't want to be on the Post Office Committee. It doesn't really lead you anywhere. It's not sexy. You'd much rather be on the Foreign Relations Committee, or the Homeland Security Committee, or the Agricultural Committee, or something of that sort. And so what a congressman has to do, or what a representative has to do, is establish his reputation, or her reputation, and that's done by joining and participating in the deliberations of a committee. Now, one of the things I didn't say, that I should have said, is that obviously every committee has to be divided into a series of subcommittees. Again, to take a personal example, when I lived or worked in Washington, much of my time was spent dealing with, responding to requests from the Subcommittee on East Asian Affairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I had colleagues who responded to the Subcommittee on Southeast Asian Affairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and also the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and so on and so forth. So you see, we have 20 or so committees, each of which can be divided up into as many as 15 or 20 even, or 10 at least, subcommittees. And so in the words of some unknown sage who said, if you're walking through the halls of Capitol Hill and you see somebody whom you think you recognize but can't recall the name, just say, "Good morning, Mr. Chairman," or "Good morning, Madam Chairman," and chances are you'll be right. Now, it's easy to make jokes about this, and I have made my joke. But remember, the committee structure is extremely important because that is where Congress gets very substantive. That's where it comes down to particular issues. And testifying on Capitol Hill can be an extremely challenging experience because you do find senators and congressmen who really do know their stuff. And they ask a bunch of questions that you have to work very hard to respond to. So I personally think the committee system, which is something we've always had, it works. It does what it is supposed to do. How do we deal with the fact that everybody wants to get into the sexiest committee or the jazziest committee? Well, part of the way you deal with it is by having a number of subcommittees. All right, then they can claim membership in a large committee and do all of that. But some years ago, I forget exactly how many years ago, the leadership in House and Senate got smart. And they said, you know, seniority is all well and good, and we gain a lot. But by relying upon seniority to make committee assignments, we don't always get the best trained people in the right places. And so a custom has grown up whereby every member of the House and every member of the Senate gets at least one committee of major importance, at least one and often two. And that's a matter of trade-offs and that's a matter of negotiation, but that is a fact. So I think we can say, generally speaking, that the best people, the best equipped and best qualified people, do get on the committees that are of direct relevance to them. Obviously, if you're from Eastern North Carolina, you want to be on a committee that touches upon agriculture, preferably on a subcommittee that has something to do with tobacco, preferably. And that principle applies throughout. Now, there's even a fla-fla social sciencey term for all of this. And I'm going to refer to it as the bargain. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if on your next exam, under the identify, define, and state the significance of the following, you see something called the bargain. And this is what the bargain is. The bargain refers to what I will in turn refer to as the distributive theory of committee work, which works as follows. All members will seek assignment to best serve their constituencies. Right? That's just, can we accept that? The leadership will always do its best to accommodate those requests. And the third point of the bargain is each committee member supports the other's legislative requests. So, in other words, Joe says on the agricultural something subcommittee, says, I got this bill that I want to deal with to regulate and sort of solve some problems for the people in my district who grow pomegranates. Okay? And he goes to Pete or Jane or Harriet and says, now this is my pomegranate bill. I know you got something going on carrots. I'll support your carrots if you support my pomegranates. And in fact, that's the principle. So, committee assignments, the bargain. Members of representatives and senators seek the committee that's going to do them the most good. The leadership does its best, and in every case, exceeds to as many of their requests as they can. When the committee works, each committee member supports the other committee member. And there you see how the committee system holds together. So if we're clear about what we mean by the bargain, then let's talk about legislation. There are many, many different kinds of legislation. No, there are several different kinds of legislation. The most common is what is known as the bill, or a bill. A bill is simply a legislative proposal. It can be public, it can be private, that passes both houses and is signed by the president. Senators and congressmen may introduce private bills. Let's say that you, well, an example, let's say that you are a startup company somewhere, and you need some highly trained mathematicians and programmers and so on. And there aren't any around. You've gone to the best places. You've gone to Carteret Community College and can't find anybody. You've gone to North Carolina State and can't find anybody. God forbid you've even gone to Virginia Tech and can't find anybody. And so you have all this problem. So you have to look outside the committee. You can get a private member bill that will authorize the immigration or authorize entrance permits, work permits for a certain number of people to come and work for you in a particular place. That's a very typical kind of private member's bill. A public member's bill is something that affects the public, the budget, seat belts in cars, any of these kinds of things. A second kind of legislation, though it really isn't legislation, we can talk of as a simple resolution. Sense of the House, sense of the Senate. The United States Senate hereby goes on record as saying that Carteret Community College is the swingin'est place of its kind south of the Mason-Dixon line. Okay, I know I'm being a little silly, but it's that kind of morning. I hope you'll forgive me. Sense of the Senate. It means just that. This is what the Senate agrees. The president doesn't sign it. It has no force in law or anything else. Then there is a concurrent resolution where the House and Senate together express their wish or their intention to do something, to pass a budget by November 13th, whenever, to balance the budget by whenever, to reach a decision on the Iranian nuclear deal by such and such a time. These do have the force of law, but there seems always to be a way to extend the deadline. Okay? And then finally we have a joint resolution, where simply the Congress says, the House and the Senate together will say, we're going to do X or we're going to do Y, period. They just say, we're going to do this, so on. The president signs it. That has the force. That has the force of law. Now, one of the things I have not spoken of so far is what is the mechanism? What is the essence of how a bill becomes law? What are the major forces on all of this? And this is difficult simply because things are changing. The process of finding the words to express what's in a bill, writing a bill, that process is known as a markup. What happens in committee is known as a markup. And what happens in the Senate is known as a report. So what I'm suggesting here is that, or what I'm saying here is that, House and Senate go through this process of holding hearings on bills, doing a whole range of things. It's all in your text. And out of that comes a set of language. This is known as the markup, or as the report. So a markup goes from the chairman of the subcommittee to the full committee, where it can be changed again. And then it is submitted to the Speaker's office. The Speaker's office and the Rules Committee then issue what is called a rule. A rule determines the conditions under which a bill will be considered. It determines how much time will be allotted for debate, if any. It determines whether or not a bill can be amended. The terms for this, it issues an open rule, which means almost unlimited debate, yes, lots of amendments, all of these things, or a closed rule, which says no, it's going to be very, very highly disciplined. There is not going to be much room for discussion of these matters. And so we issue an open rule, a closed rule. Who makes that decision? Ultimately, it's the Speaker who makes that decision, which is why the Speaker is so powerful. Now, the Speaker does not make that decision based purely upon his or her preferences. The Speaker obviously must take into consideration what committee chairs and what subcommittee chairs and what the President wants to do as he makes that decision. Sometimes you don't want a bill to pass. You'd like a bill to be defeated. And so you might issue an open rule so it will be simply amended to death and go nowhere. 90% of such bills do, or such proposals do go nowhere. They die in subcommittee. And part of that process is because of the nature of the rule that is issued and the rules that are set for debate and passage. The Speaker is key to all of this. Now, I don't remember whether I have spoken to you before about the whip system or not. If I have, let me just quickly review it. When I say how do congressmen know when to be where and how to vote on various issues? Because often they don't know how to vote because things are so complex and they haven't got time to read into the bill. The Speaker has at his disposal majority leader, as also minority leader, and the majority minority leaders and their assistants, they have people who are called whips. Whips are members of the Senate and House who have expertise in a particular area, or they've been around a long time and are highly effective, highly respected, or they have specialized knowledge. It is their job to keep track of the membership and where each member stands on a particular issue within their area of responsibility and deliver those votes on time. So, how does a bill become a law? There are two excellent charts for that on page 302 and page 303. And all I can do at this stage is take you through the general outlines of the whole thing and ask you to fill in the blanks for yourself. What I seriously propose is that you write, you read these, you study these very, very carefully. And if you have any questions, there is a space on our page. It's called The Price of Beans in China. And I would like you to post your questions on that space, on our Moodle page. And then I will respond and we can have that discussion on it that way. I don't know how else to do it. Basically, Congressman X has a proposal. Congressman X has a proposal. So he goes to the drop box on the Speaker's desk and he drops in his proposal. Would probably also go to the Clerk of the House and say, here's my proposal. The Speaker looks at that proposal and says, aha, this is for the Foreign Affairs Committee, sends it to the Foreign Affairs Committee. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee says, aha, this is for the Subcommittee on East Asian Affairs. And there it goes. Now, you have to understand, before any of that happens, Congressman X has already gone to the Speaker and said, I'm going to put this proposal in the drop box. And this is what I would like you to do. Will you do it? And the Speaker will say, no, Joe, or no, Alice. This is not the time to do that. Or the Speaker will say, yeah, I'll be glad to do that. And so he can do that. But the Speaker has to make that judgment. And there it goes. So, the chair of the committee assigns it to a subcommittee. A subcommittee holds hearings, which is to say they find experts and invite them in to testify. When you testify before a committee, two things happen. One, you have to write a report. It's called a testimony report. And you write that out. You answer all the questions that they have to give. Plus, you've got some space to give your own opinions. And then you have to appear before the committee, where members of the committee ask you questions. This is where they can establish a record of where they stand on a particular issue. In my experience, testifying before Congress has been fun. It's been a kick. It's been something that I thought of as important and having some result and so on. Sometimes it's just a show, but most often it does have a real purpose. Anyway, subcommittee does its report, does its markup, goes back to the chairman of the full committee, does its markup, goes back to the Speaker, who then issues a rule. And the rule, as I said, determines how long, the conditions under which a bill will be debated, passed, and so on and so forth. What happens in the Senate is mostly the same kind of thing. The trouble is that the House and Senate never, ever come to terms on the same issue. And so the process that I've described for the House is basically the same in the Senate. The issue then becomes what happens in a conference committee. And this is very important because what happens in a conference committee is largely the result of decisions made by the Senate Majority Leader and by the Speaker of the House and by the Speakers and by the House Majority Leader. It's a three-way or a combination decision. And again, much depends upon what they want the desired outcome to be. One of the problems with Obamacare resolution or change was that it never reached the point. Had it reached the point of needing to develop a conference committee, can you imagine what it would have been like to staff such a committee? How could you possibly ever do such a thing? All right, the point I'm asking you to take from here is traditionally the role of the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader have been paramount in determining the calendar of events, the order, the agenda of each House, the order in which the agenda of each House will be taken up, and the conditions under which each House will debate and process the questions before for us. The sources of authority for the Speaker have been both formal, that's the Speaker's job, it's what the rules of the House say, this is what the Speaker's supposed to do. And they've also been the result of the prestige and the power, therefore the power of the Speaker. I suggest to you, I put to you today, that the rules of the House and the Senate no longer have the same import or the same impact that they had before. I put to you today that the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader no longer carry the prestige that they carried beforehand. That there has been a challenge to our way of governance. So, why are we moving away from, or why have we moved away from congressional government to presidential government or executive government? The trend began around World War I and picked up steam in 1932 during the Great Depression, when the national situation simply required rapid response and targeted response in a way that the legislative branch simply could not provide because it was as complex as it was. Please understand, the process in the House and Senate is supposed to be slow. It's supposed to be wasteful of time. That is a price that the founders decided we would pay and should pay in order to avoid a concentration of power in the legislative branch. It's part of our checks and balances. It's an example of how the checks and balances built into the system had an impact that was not expected. That doesn't mean it was a bad impact. I don't think it was a bad impact. I think it is good that we slow these things down and that we do have to work very, very carefully on a point-by-point basis. Secondly, what happened is, we're talking now about the shift from presidential from congressional to presidential government. The second thing that's happened is that the issues simply got terribly complex. By which I mean, it's very, very difficult, and no one senator or no one congressman can possibly keep track of things. And so we have the evolution of an executive bureaucracy, which has a mastery of details. This is what the Trump supporters and others refer to as the deep state, the bureaucracy. The ones who say, we just can't do this, or we can't do that, or whatever. So there's that rise of bureaucracy based upon the need for expertise. A third reason that we have moved towards presidential government is because compromise has become much more difficult. Now, we've already been through this, and I don't want to, beat it to death. In the last 40 years, it's been much more difficult to find compromise on any issue. Once we lost the Soviet Union, or once the Soviet Union collapsed, once we won the Cold War, in fact, it was difficult to find agreement on a whole lot of issues because they changed. In the 1960s, recall, the emergence of rights and liberties, with questions of right and liberties emerged at stage center. It's hard to compromise on these. In the 2000s, we had a recession, a major recession, where economic status became equated with or became joined with matters of race, religion, and other things. For these reasons, we have come to something called gridlock, and that's where the House and Senate are at this time. I would argue that legislative relations and executive relations are deteriorating. We are supposed to have a situation in which Republicans control the House, Republicans control the Senate, Republicans control the executive, and Republicans control most of the state governments throughout the country. What's the issue? Now, I'm not going to bore you with this because you know what I'm going to say. What does it mean to be a Republican? And what does it mean to be a Democrat? There were always different kinds of Republicans and different Democrats. Remember we talked earlier about free market Republicans or Wall Street Republicans as opposed to staunch conservatives, and we talked about labor union Democrats and all of those things. Those issues, we still have those divisions, but the divisions have become much deeper and much sharper and much wider. The original problem that we had was we moved away from legislative government because it was hard to get agreement on a particular issue. That's happening again. And the end result will be the same, where we have an executive that will step in and do what needs to be done. Only, and this is not to be partisan or to take a stab at President Trump, I'm simply being descriptive. Only now, the executive is not stepping in to compensate for the inability of Congress to come to a conclusion. Rather, the executive is making it more difficult. And I will stand by that statement, and I promise you, it's not in any way intended to be offensive to President Trump or to any of his supporters. It is rather a simple statement of fact. So where we go from here depends upon what happens in the executive branch. Now, I just had a thought. Committee staffs will, at times, act in ways that they think are in accordance with what their bosses want, but which may not be in accordance with what their bosses want. And let me give you an example. It was decided by some people in committee staff that an institute for the study of Chinese military affairs should be located at the National Defense University, where I happen to work. And I was asked to draw up the design for such an institution, which I did. And then I took it over to the people who asked me to do the work, and they said, well, how much is that going to cost? And I sort of gulped and said $7 million. And they didn't bat an eye. And I said, isn't that a lot of money? And they said, that won't even be an asterisk in the budget bill. I later learned that the congressman, because this was on the congressional side, the congressman who was going to sponsor that this proposal was going to be put into a bill that a particular congressman was going to sponsor, and he had no idea it was going to be in there. That suggests there's nothing criminal about that. There's probably nothing wrong with that, because the staffer knew that his boss would approve of such a thing. It's just that there were other things that were more important and so on. And probably at some point the congressman would have been briefed on that. Congressional staff is very, very important. But we must remember that they are participants in the process by which our government decides who gets what, when, where, and how. They are participants in that process. And that's what I'd like to leave you with, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for your attention.